At 6:12 a.m. 12 U.S., sailors on two Navy riverine boats are suddenly boxed. Music. And as 50 Iranian vessels close around them, turning open water into a controlled ring. 25 minutes later, music. The trap is fully set, and the confrontation becomes a test of restraint under pressure with weapons. Visible, radios active, and no room to misread intent. The rest of the story follows how that short window unfolded, step by step, and how a minute's long swarm maneuver can ripple into strategy, messaging, and risk. Music far beyond the waterline. The morning begins like routine transit, with crews focused on navigation and standard watch music procedures. The waterway is tight enough that distance can be deceptive, and that matters when small craft begin changing course for no obvious reason. The first shifts look like normal traffic until the pattern starts to repeat. At 6:12 a.m., the Americans register multiple fast boats, altering their lines at once. The geometry changes from passing contacts to converging tracks, creating the early shape of a ring. The U.S. boats keep discipline, avoid aggressive maneuvers, and begin documenting positions and movements as a number of nearby craft rises. Within minutes, the encirclement becomes explicit. Iranian vessels take up positions ahead, behind, and off the flanks, restricting the Americans' ability to move without forcing a collision or a sudden turn. Weapons are visible, but not raised into a firing posture, and in that detail the intent becomes clear. Control the space without triggering a shot. The imbalance is immediate and undeniable. Two boats with 12 sailors face a swarm, large enough to dictate distance and direction from every bearing. The Americans, slow to reduce risk, maintain steady communications and treat every action as something that will be replayed later as evidence. At 6:37 a.m., the 25 minutes later point is reached from the initial contact moment, and the ring is effectively closed. The encounter is now about restraint and safe exit, not winning a standoff. The next acts track what was communicated, what was demanded, and how the situation was resolved without a firefight. Even as the pressure continued to climb, the swarm reaches a stable formation. Iranian fast boats are no longer maneuvering into position. They are holding it. The space around the two music U.S. boats is now fully controlled, with every potential exit covered by overlapping hulls. From this music point forward, the encounter changes character. It is no longer about movement, but about compliance and endurance. 50 vessels maintain pressure on two U.S. boats carrying 12 sailors, not by advancing, but by refusing to yield distance. Radio traffic becomes structured and repetitive. Iranian crews restate instructions, reinforcing music authority through consistency rather than escalation. The Americans acknowledge each transmission, keeping responses neutral and procedural, careful not to introduce tone that could be interpreted as resistance. The enclosure tightens in subtle ways. Boats adjust by small increments, closing gaps measured in meters, not lengths. The Americans respond by minimizing motion, holding steady headings, and avoiding sudden corrections that could be misread. Weapons remain visible throughout the formation. Mounted guns and rifles are present across multiple decks. Music, but none are brought into firing posture. Control is maintained through numbers, proximity, and discipline, not through overt threat. Documentation continues without pause. Cameras remain active. Logs record positions and spacing, and communications are preserved line by line. Every second is treated as part of a future review, not just a present standoff. As time advances beyond 6:30 a.m., the pressure does not spike. It settles. The swarm holds its shape, signaling that this phase is meant to be sustained, not music rushed. The Americans remain boxed but stable, operating under rules designed to avoid a single miscalculation. By the end of this phase, the outcome is no longer uncertain. The Americans are contained. The Iranians control the water space, and the next step will not be decided by maneuvering. It will be decided by instruction, response, and the terms under which the encounter is allowed to end. After 6:54 a.m., the encounter enters its most fragile phase. The swarm holds steady, not advancing, not loosening. Music applying pressure through presence. Alone, 50 Iranian vessels maintain a controlled ring around 2 U.S. boats with 12 sailors, creating a situation where movement itself becomes a risk. Radio instructions repeat with increasing specificity. Course limits are restated, speed constraints emphasized, and warnings framed as safety guidance rather than threats. The Americans acknowledge each transmission, understanding that tone and timing now matter as much as content. The geometry tightens by degrees, not leaps. Several boats adjust, positioned by meters, closing small gaps that had allowed minimal maneuvering room. The effect is cumulative. The Americans' options narrow without a single aggressive motion. Weapons remain visible across the formation. Rifles, mounted guns, and cruise serve systems are clearly present, but none are raised into a firing posture. The message is consistent. Control is being exercised through numbers, spacing, and discipline, not through music, force. The Americans continue documenting everything. Cameras run uninterrupted. Logs capture headings, spacing, and vessel music. Counts and communications are preserved line by line. Every second is treated as potential music evidence because this phase will later be judged frame by frame. As minutes pass, the pressure becomes psychological as much as physical. 12 sailors operate in a confined space surrounded by dozens of hulls, aware that a single misinterpreted music gesture could escalate the situation instantly. Predictability becomes the primary music defense. Additional instructions arrive over the radio, clarifying expectations. The Americans are directed to hold position, maintain music, reduce speed, and avoid course changes. Compliance is measured not just in responses but in the absence of movement. The imbalance remains absolute. 50-2 in vessels means the swarm can rotate crews, reposition incrementally, and sustain the enclosure indefinitely. The Americans, by contrast, must conserve focus and discipline under constant observation. At this point, escalation would be irrational for either side, but the risk remains asymmetric. One sudden move by 2 boats can be read as intent, while 50 boats adjusting together reads as control. That asymmetry defines the climax of the encounter. The Americans choose restraint consistently. Hands remain visible, motion slow, communications brief. Every decision is filtered through one priority: avoid creating a moment that forces a response. The swarm holds. Iranian boats maintain spacing and orientation, signaling that the objective has already been achieved. The space is controlled. The Americans are contained, and the narrative leverage now belongs to the side that dictates terms without firing. As time advances deeper into this phase, the encounter becomes less about navigation and more about messaging. Control has been demonstrated, restraint has been tested, and the outcome will hinge on how the exit is structured, not on who blinked first. The confrontation reaches its peak tension without a single shot fired. 50 vessels, 2 boats, 12 sailors, and a prolonged standoff built entirely from proximity and discipline. What follows next is not escalation, but resolution. And how that resolution is framed will matter far beyond the water. Where it began, after the prolonged standoff, the encounter begins to move toward resolution, not music, through relaxation, but through structure. Iranian boats maintain their positions, while instructions become more explicit, signaling that the objective is no longer containment, but compliance under supervision. The pressure does not disappear, it is redirected. Radio, traffic narrows to music, a set of repeated commands. Speed limits are restated, course expectations clarified, and movement windows defined and precise. Music terms, the Americans acknowledge, each instruction responding in short, procedural language that avoids ambiguity. The numbers still define the moment. 50 vessels remain in place, around 2 U.S. boats carrying 12 sailors, ensuring that every movement is observed. Music from multiple angles. The enclosure does not break. It reshapes slightly to guide direction. Rather than deny it, weapons remain visible throughout the formation. Rifles and mounted systems are present, but posture stays controlled, reinforcing that escalation is not the goal. Authority is communicated through repetition, spacing, and patience. The Americans comply step by step. Engines adjust incrementally. Headings change within narrow limits, and every action is slow enough to be unmistakably deliberate. Cameras continue recording, and logs remain active, capturing the transition from standoff to managed movement. As compliance progresses, the swarm mirrors each change. Several boats shift to new positions, maintaining coverage while opening a controlled path. The formation adapts without dissolving, ensuring that control is never relinquished. The imbalance remains clear even as tension eases. Slightly, 2 boats are permitted, limited movement, but only within boundaries enforced by dozens of hulls. The message is consistent. Freedom of motion is conditional. By the end of this phase, the encounter has shifted decisively. The Americans are no longer boxed in place, but they are not free. They are being guided under watch with every meter of movement contingent on continued compliance. This transition sets the stage for the final outcome. The confrontation does not end with force or chaos, but with a controlled exit shaped entirely by leverage established earlier. The next act follows how that exit is completed and how a short encounter becomes a lasting point of reference. When the encounter finally ends, it does not close with a dramatic release, but with a quiet recalibration. 50 Iranian vessels, 2 U.S. boats, music, and 12 sailors separate without a shot fired, leaving behind a record built almost entirely from minutes, spacing, and restraint. Music, what remains is not damage on holes, but implications that travel far beyond the water. The first lesson is about numbers. Superiority in modern maritime encounters does not always require weapons discharge. 50-2 is leveraged by itself, especially when combined with coordination and patience. Control can be asserted through geometry, not firepower. The second lesson is about rules. The Americans operated under strict music constraints designed to prevent escalation, and those rules shaped every response. In a compressed environment, music compliance is not surrender, it is risk management. 12. Sailors avoided turning proximity into catastrophe by choosing predictability over impulse. The third lesson is about documentation. Cameras, logs, and recorded communications mattered as much as engines and rudders. In encounters like this, music, the outcome does not end on the water. It continues in briefings, statements, and how events are framed to audiences who never see the hulls that define the space. There is Also a lesson in time. Roughly 25 minutes were enough to demonstrate control, restraint, and imbalance without crossing into violence. Short encounters can carry long shadows, especially when they confirm patterns rather than create new ones. For naval planners, the message is clear. Swarm tactics using dozens of small craft can create decisive pressure against limited assets without triggering open conflict. For crews, the takeaway is discipline, slow movements, control communication, and adherence to protocol can prevent a bad situation from becoming irreversible. For viewers, this story is a reminder that not all confrontations look dramatic. Some of the most consequential moments unfold quietly, measured in meters and minutes rather than explosions. The absence of gunfire does not mean the absence of power. If you want to understand how these encounters shape strategy, messaging, and risk in real time, subscribe to the channel. We break down events step by step, focusing on facts, numbers, and decisions that matter. New episodes dive into how moments like this echo across regions and doctrines long after the boats separate.